Thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome. We're very pleased to welcome you all to this year's launch of the UNFIF's Gender Balance Index. Please feel free to send your questions all throughout the meeting via the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. On the UNFIF Live webpage, you'll be able to download the 2021 index, the program of the launch, and other informative materials. The video recording will be available shortly on our on-demand webpage. We hope you'll enjoy the launch. And now please welcome John Orchard, UNFIF's Chief Executive Officer.
Thank you, Diana. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the launch of UNFIF's 8th Gender Balance Index, which looks at the gender composition of the senior roles at central banks, public pensions, sovereign wealth funds, and for the first time this year at major commercial banks. A handful of the 500 plus institutions we've analysed do score 100, which represents perfect balance. There's only 1% of them. Most don't, including our own organisation, as you'll hear. And the averages overall are around the high 20s, which is pretty poor, although some progress is being made in important places, and we'll talk about that today. My team will take you through the findings in just a moment. Worryingly, the fairly slow progress in the right direction overall in recent years may be reversed by the time we publish the next Gender Balance Index. As Anna Portin, the Executive Chair of Santander, writes in our foreword of the report, the social and economic consequences of the pandemic have fallen disproportionately on women. A she session, as she calls it, is in prospect. That's not just a moral and ethical problem, a social one, it's an economic one too, as Anna explains. It seems a shame not to apply the flexible working forced on us by COVID, for example, to bring through a revolution in that field for parents of young children, as an example. There is good news. In addition to Christine Lagarde at the ECB, there are notable senior central bankers who are women making a difference. Two of them joined Danai Kyriakopoulou's panel after the results from Kenya and Spain. One of the few institutions with a perfect score for balance is the Federal Reserve of Richmond, who join us too. So do stay on to listen to them. Interestingly, however, non-Western institutions tend to dominate the top of the chart for central banks, as you'll see. Meanwhile, on average, the commercial banking sector, included, as I mentioned, for the first time this year, slightly beats the official sector with its aggregate score of 30, at a time when one of the biggest private sector banks in the world, Citigroup, gets a female CEO in the form of Jane Fraser. But there's some very low scores from major institutions who should definitely be doing better by now, as you'll see. And some of these would definitely tend to say that they regard ESG as a priority. My colleague Clive Horwood will explore this a little later. So let's not forget the S and G in ESG. We hope our survey reminds the people at the tops of these institutions, which set an example to the rest of the financial, corporate and governmental world to double down on their efforts to make gender balance possible as they work to build back their economies better. Do please share these findings and tweet about them using the hashtags you'll see at the bottom of the presentation slide. In the meanwhile, let's get straight into the data. Katrina Usita, Deputy Head of Research, over to you.
Thank you, John. So allow me first to talk about... Thanks, John. Allow me first to talk about what the Gender Balance Index is and how exactly we measure using this. So the Gender Balance Index tracks the presence of men and women in financial institutions. Historically, we've looked at central banks, sovereign funds, and public pension funds, looking at the most senior decision-making bodies within these institutions in order to assess how many men and women exactly there are. We look at these institutions specifically because we recognize the role they play in the global economy, as well as their impact due to the large amount of assets that they hold. For the first time this year, we're introducing commercial banks as part of the index because we also recognize that commercial banks play an important role in our societies, and they also serve as an example for the wider financial industry. How do we exactly score the institutions that form part of the index? Well, we count the number of men and women who are on the executive boards, as well as the governing boards or supervisory bodies that these institutions have. In the case of central banks, this could include their monetary policy committees. So we also weight each individual that is part of those bodies that I mentioned according to level of seniority. So the more senior you are, the more your gender will impact your institution's score. Now, a perfect score of 100 means that the institution has achieved gender balance based on the methodology that I described, while a score of 0 means that you're still quite far away from gender balance, and in fact, there's only one gender represented in your executive board or your governing board. So what did we find out from this year's index? Here are some of the key findings. Less than 1% of institutions achieve gender balance or a score of 100. You would have seen from the slide earlier that the index covers 540 institutions. Out of that 540, only 3 achieved a score of 100. Out of all of these institutions, only 71 are headed by women. And in fact, 56 institutions have no women at all in their executive teams or their boards. You'll see in the chart in front of you that we've managed to track this over time. So for central banks, you see a steady progress over time, but still the score is quite low. It's at 27 this year. For sovereign funds, it's even lower. So despite an improvement over time, sovereign funds have struggled to even reach 20. In the case of pension funds, they do quite well, or they seem to. They have quite a high score with 47, but this is partly because in the past, we've only been able to look at European public pension funds. There are hundreds of pension funds in the world, and the European sample already has about 200 funds, so that's why we haven't been able to include everyone. And as mentioned earlier, this is the first year that we're including commercial banks. Based on our sample of the 50 largest commercial banks with representation from every region, they have an average score of 30, which seems better than their public sector counterparts. However, this is still quite low. Looking now at central banks specifically, so I have there on the screen the top 10 for central banks. We have the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond entering the index at number 1 with just a score of 100. And I say entering because this is the first year that we've included the regional Federal Reserve banks as part of our index. Previously, we only looked at the system as a whole, but now we have each individual bank. The top 10 is composed of central banks that are actually quite close to gender balance based on our scoring system. So you have 7 of them actually scoring 90 or above. Now, doing this index every year allows us to track progress over time. And because of that, we know that 79 central bank scores improved in the past year, while those of 51 declined. So if you recall the aggregate figures from earlier, the central bank score kind of stagnated. Part of that is because of this offsetting between improvements and declines in scores. 30 central banks out of 185 that we cover have no women at all in their executive teams and boards. Looking at scores per region, we see that most regions are actually improving over time, with a few exceptions. So a glaring exception is the Middle East. You see there in the chart a steady decline over time. Part of this is because the Bank of Israel a few years ago had a female governor and a female deputy governor. Both posts are now occupied by men. In the case of North America, you also see a steady decline from the time that Janet Yellen left the Federal Reserve Board. You see also a dip from last year, from 35 to 30 this year. Part of that is because of Carolyn Wilkins leaving her post at the Bank of Canada and Christopher Waugh being appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. So a man was appointed in an institution, a female left another. These are affecting the global score overall, as well as the score for that region. Doing the index allows us to investigate the proportion of women who are on different levels. So I mentioned earlier that 30 central banks have no women at all in their executive teams or their boards. That translates to about 16%. The other 84% of central banks have at least one female senior executive or board member. On the level of governors or deputy governors, we found that 39% of central banks have at least one female governor or one female deputy governor. Most of these women happen to be deputy governors, and you'll see the numbers in front of you. Out of the 185 central banks, 35% have at least one female deputy governor. But if you look at the level of the governor, only 10% of central banks have female governors. That 10% is 18. So 18 of the governors that we track are female, and 12 of the 18 female governors currently in office now are the first women to occupy that role. Now, we had an opportunity to promote more women to the role of governor, central bank governor. However, it didn't seem to have been taken up last year. Over the past year, there were 31 governors who were appointed. Only one of them was a woman. It was Nguyen Thi Hong of the Central Bank of Vietnam. Now, allow me to bring some color into the numbers, right? So I have a few examples. One is the European Central Bank, which is a central bank that a lot of us would be familiar with. So the European Central Bank scores 30 in the GBI. Still quite far from gender balance. It's far from 100, but it is above the regional weighted average, or sorry, global weighted average for central banks, which is 27. To generate the score for the ECB, we look at its governing council. So the governing council is composed of the executive board as well as the national central bank governors in the Euro area. Just looking at the executive board, right? Right now, there are two women there. So the president, Christine Lagarde, and an executive board member, Isabel Schnabel. They are two of only 5 women. The entire existence of the ECB, only 5 women have sat on the executive board. Now, out of all of the Euro area central bank governors, only one has been female, and that's Christella Georgiadji of the Central Bank of Cyprus. She left her post in 2018, so you can't see her in the photo over there. Another example that I'd like to point out is the Federal Reserve System. As a whole, the Federal Reserve System scores 31 in the GBI. That's quite similar to the ECB. To generate the score for the Federal Reserve System, we look at its Board of Governors, so the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, as well as the 12 regional bank presidents. Now, aside from generating a score for the system as a whole, we also calculate scores for each individual regional banks. As I said earlier, this is the first time we're doing this because we really want to take a good look at each body. 7 out of 12 regional banks score above 70, putting them in the top 20. So some of these regional banks are actually doing better than the Federal Reserve System as a whole. 3 out of the 12 regional bank presidents are women. We counted them towards the 18 that I mentioned earlier. You can see them here on your screen. So we've got Esther George, Loretta Mester, and Mary Daly. The lowest scorer among the Federal Reserve banks or the regional banks is the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston with a score of 29. A bit low, but still higher than the central bank average of 27. Looking now at sovereign funds. Now, sovereign funds generally struggle in our index. They've scored quite poorly over time, but there are some outliers. One such outlier is the Victorian Funds Management Corporation. So it retains the top spot. It was also last year's top scorer among sovereign funds, but VFMC this time scored a perfect 100. And if you look at the top 10 that's on your screen right now, you'll notice that really VFMC is an outlier because the other funds in the top 10 actually score quite low. So funds SA in second place, just 74. Out of 72 funds in total, only 8 are headed by women. 12 funds have no women at all in their executive teams or boards. That kind of explains to you why the average score for sovereign funds is quite low compared to the other institution categories. So overall, 28 fund scores improved, while those of 23 declined. Let's look at some regional scores now. So we calculate regional scores using the methodology I described, but we generate an average that we then weight according to assets under management. That's because we want the scores to reflect really how much influence these funds have, and that can be measured by their size. So we see a pattern here where the Middle East tends to do poorly. You might recall from the central banks that this is quite similar. Asia Pacific also not doing very well, but this is dragging down the other regions because of the way we calculate the aggregate score. So the global score suffers a little bit from these larger funds that are not very gender balanced, dragging down the score. Looking now at public pension funds. So as I said, in the past, we've only been able to look at European public pension funds, but this is the first time that we've been able to look at Asia-Pacific institutions. And we're able to draw now some comparisons across these two regions. Europe scores 47, more than double of Asia-Pacific score of 19. In fact, if you look at the top 10 on this slide, all of them are European funds except for one, and that's in fourth place, Aware Super, an Australian fund. The Danish pension fund for nurses retains the top spot, so it has a score of 100. It also scored 100 last year, the first institution to achieve that in the history of our index, and it has maintained that score. Overall, 77 fund scores improved, while those of 69 declined. So you see a similar story here where you have improvements in certain institutions, but this is being pulled back by declines in others. Out of 233 funds in total, 42 are headed by women. This is a bit of a larger share. It's about 18% compared to the other institutions that had fewer female top leaders. Moving on now to the commercial banks. So commercial banks, we noticed by introducing them this year, are actually outperforming the other institutions. So they're ahead of the central banks, sovereign funds, and the combined score for the pension funds is 25. So the commercial banks are ahead. The top scorer is ANZ with a score of 83. Notably, no commercial bank scores over 90, and only one bank in the top 10 has a female CEO. So you might wonder, how can commercial banks be doing so well if their top 10 isn't scoring very well compared to the top 10 of the others? That's because the scores are more consistent across commercial banks. In fact, there's not a single commercial bank that has a score of 0. So all the commercial banks in our selected sample of 50 have at least one woman in their executive team or their boards. Out of the 50 commercial banks, we have 3 have CEOs who are female. So this is quite low compared to the others. That's about 6%. That is 6%. Although we expect this number to go up soon. The cutoff for our research was January 2021. And since then, there have been some women who have or will be assuming posts as CEOs of leading banks. So this includes Jane Fraser of Citi. This includes Helen Wong of OCBC, as well as Hannah Al-Rostamani of the First Abu Dhabi Bank. Looking at commercial banks by region, North American banks are ahead, so they are closer to gender balance with a regional average of 40. Interestingly, this is one category where Asia Pacific actually does quite well. So it scores the same as Europe. If you recall from the other institution categories, Asia Pacific tends to not do very well, but this could also be because Europe is doing badly when it comes to the commercial banks. So 13 out of 20 European banks score less than 30. Since there are so few female CEOs among the commercial banks, we wanted to look at the pipeline of future CEOs, right? So we looked a level below CEO and investigated those who are on the C-suite. So men and women who are in CIO roles, CFO, COO. We found that 15% of the individuals on this level are women. So only a very small share are in the C-suite. A small share are women in the C-suite. Among the executive committee members who are running P&L divisions, so those people who are in crucial roles that affect the performance of a bank, only 18% of them are women, suggesting that there aren't a lot of women who are in this pipeline, in the path to CEO. In fact, a lot of the women in our index are in inward-facing roles. So 39% of the women in executive teams in our index are in administrative roles compared to just 15% of the men. So I'm going to stop there. That's it for the index findings. You can read more when you check out the report. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Natalia, who will walk you through another important element of the research that we conduct to complement the index findings, and that is the survey. Before I do that, allow me first to thank all of the central bankers and members of financial institutions, executives from commercial banks who contributed to this year's report. Natalia will be sharing some insights that they have written about when she walks you through the findings of the survey. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you, Kat. This is the second year that UNFIF conducts a survey to gain an understanding of the actions and policies that central banks have developed in order to improve their gender balance. 50 institutions participated in this year's survey. 48 are central banks and 2 are multilateral organizations with functions related to financial stability. Scattered throughout this year's report, readers can find written pieces and interviews from 26 individuals from central banks, pension funds, international organizations, and commercial banks, to whom we are very grateful for their contribution to our report. Mary Daly, San Francisco's Fed president, was one of our interviewees, and her words allow us to understand that progress in gender balance doesn't happen naturally. It requires positive action, and our survey findings reveal that a lot more needs to be done. Alessandra Perazzelli, Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Italy, stressed in our report that gender quotas have helped an unprecedented number of women throughout their careers. However, our survey findings reveal that few save seats for women. Only 8% of institutions have gender quotas for their boards or monetary policy committees. 3 are in Europe and 1 in Latin America. Access to senior roles is not ensured either, as only 6 institutions guarantee equal gender representation at the interview stage for selection processes in senior management. Banco Central de Chile is one of the 6 institutions. There must be at least 1 female candidate throughout the whole selection process, and any exceptions must be justified before the bank's council. Respondents providing programs and training aimed at supporting progress in females grew to 64% from 54% last year. Diversity training increased in popularity, with 1/3 of central banks having them in place, up from 22% last year. However, mentorship programs have fallen. Only 14% of surveyed institutions offer them, down from 22% last year. What you can measure, you can manage, asserted Shelley Madeira from the London Stock Exchange Group. Closely related to measurement, Aniela Unguresan, co-founder of Edge Certified Foundation, describes external validation as key to make change both visible and credible. Measuring the gender pay gap could help central banks take steps to close it, but only 1/3 of respondents say they track this. 15% of surveyed institutions assert they do not have a gender pay gap without even measuring it. The biggest pay gap reported was one of 11.6% in favor of men. The Central Bank of Iceland is a positive outlier with a pay gap of 1.6% in favor of women. There is low external certification uptake among our survey respondents, with only 27% of institutions. Banco de Mexico is the only central bank certified both nationally and internationally. Elsie Awaji, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Ghana, pointed out that the pandemic has presented a rare opportunity for flexible working arrangements as they are being widely implemented. UNFIF's survey revealed that almost all central banks offer remote working, doubling from last year. Only 4 institutions, all from Asia Pacific, do not allow this form of arrangement, with one of these respondents not having any form of flexible working at all. 71% of surveyed institutions affirmed these new working norms had been established due to COVID-19. As a parent of 3 children, Anita Angelovska-Bijovska, Governor of the National Bank of the Republic of North Macedonia, stressed in our report that equal opportunities also bring no new challenges in juggling between personal and professional life. As a father of 2 girls, Marwan Lahabesi, Governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia, points out that gender equality is not only a women's issue, but should concern and involve men as well. Regarding policies aimed at supporting working parents, nearly 2/3 of respondents mentioned having some form of childcare benefit, with subsidies being the most common form of support. 30% of institutions mentioned having a child care facility on-site or with an affiliate association. Both the central banks of Uganda and Mexico also have breastfeeding rooms. When asked if the provision of this child care arrangement had been established due to the pandemic, 19% of respondents answered affirmatively. More on the findings we have briefly mentioned now can be found in the report, which we encourage you all to download from UNFIF's website. Now, I will hand over to our Chief Economist and Head of Research, Danae Kriakopoulou, who will moderate the panel discussion. Over to you, Danae.
Thank you very much, Natalia and Kat, for this presentation. There's a lot of meat in this report, and indeed, we encourage you all to read this. I'd like now to welcome to the stage, to the virtual stage, our panelists for today. So we have Tom Barkin, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. We haven't met before, but Tom has been very active in supporting the diversity agenda, and back in October also hosted the Women in Banking Symposium at the Richmond Federal Reserve. We have Margarita Delgado, Deputy Governor of the Banco de España, joining us. And I remember last year you were hosting a Women in Diversity conference in Central Bank, which was unfortunately postponed because of COVID, and we didn't get the chance to have that discussion back then, but the Banco de España has also been doing a lot of initiatives in that space. We have Aniela Unguresan, co-founder of EDGE Certified Foundation, and we met about a year ago when the deputy governor of the Banxico, the Central Bank of Mexico, participated in last year's activities. Said, oh, you have to meet Aniela. We work closely with EDGE to certify and look at the diversity policies of Banco de Mexico. And as Natalia mentioned, is one of the central banks that does have external validation of its diversity policies. We also are meant to be joined by the deputy governor of the Kenyan Central Bank, Sheila Mujebe. I think she's having some technical problems right now, but she will hopefully join us later. So we'll have a discussion in the panel to bring these findings to life, to talk about why does diversity matter, how can institutions achieve it, and also how has it been affected by this pandemic. I encourage everyone in the audience to send us your questions throughout the discussion. Please focus these on the topic of today, which is gender diversity. Both the Eurosystem and the Federal Reserve are in quiet or blackout period as we speak, so we won't be talking about the economic outlook or anything like that. And also, please tweet and talk about the report. We have some hashtags that were in the slide before, GBI 2021 and International Women's Day 2021. So let's have more people join the conversation, even if they're not with us here today. And let's start by talking about the importance of diversity. And let me start with you, Tom, not because gentlemen first, but because Richmond first. And we heard earlier from Kat that Richmond tops this year's index, and you have a very diverse management team at the central bank, at the Reserve Bank of Richmond. But in your experience as a leader managing a diverse team, how has this mattered in crisis? And one of my favorite quotes is from Keynes, who says, it's astonishing what foolish thing one can think if they think too long alone, especially in economics. And Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland told us that in the last crisis in 2008, he thought that having very homogeneous teams contributed to groupthink and was perhaps one of the factors that created risk. So in your experience in this crisis, has diversity made a difference?
Yeah, thanks for your question. It's great to be with you. Certainly on behalf of all the men and the women in our bank who've nurtured the careers of talented women, we just appreciate the recognition. To your question, it was muddy and confusing last March, a year ago. And where we were going, where the economy was going, was not at all clear. And I have to say, issues of participation in the workforce became paramount quickly. And that was identified first by our own teammates. I mean, I first learned of the issues as I talked to people on our team before meetings or after meetings by Zoom, as I saw children crawl into the laps of people trying to do work. And that was incredibly helpful for us to understand in terms of the need that the economy had. And then in our own bank, we had senior women leaders who could lead with empathy. And the questions of how we were going to operate remotely, how are we going to bring people back remotely, those are their issues. They weren't issues of theory. And so I just think in the operation of our bank, unbelievably helpful. In the identification of what was happening in the world, unbelievably helpful. And then, of course, as you said, when you are in high uncertainty, diverse views is something our system has always embraced, and I think it came to the fore even more.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. And we'll come back on this as well in the discussion, I'm sure. Margarita, over to you now. One of the leaders in the Eurosystem, Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB, was asked earlier this year, what is the lesson that you've learned from crisis management in this pandemic? And she said, women leaders are better. We've heard about the empathetic leadership. She's also said before, when things get difficult, you call in the woman and to manage the crisis. What do you think about this idea that you bring in the women at the difficult times? It's something that we saw in the United Kingdom with the Brexit situation, and Theresa May was the woman that emerged to sort out the issues there. There is the argument about the glass cliff, that women are put in positions of power at a time where it's very difficult to make the right decisions because there's a lot of uncertainty, and that prevents the public opinion from being supportive of women being in leadership positions. How can we get around this, and how do you see that as a risk in the current crisis?
First of all, let me congratulate you, Danai, and your team for the very good report. And of course, let me congratulate Tom and the Federal Reserve of Richmond for leading this year's gender index. As you may know, we were last year on the top of the classification, but now we are in the 4th position. But again, this is for you, Tom. Thank you. You raised several questions in your questions, Danai. So regarding the more specific concept of the glass cliff, I think that certainly being promoted to take the helm at companies or organizations in the middle of a crisis is a double-edged sword. Honestly, it's not an easy and a piece of cake. On the one hand, if you're succeeding, it is a major achievement, of course. But on the other hand, the odds tend to be against you always. So reality shows us that many women are being promoted to top positions with major turnaround jobs, right? So many of them are really leading companies in a bleak situation. So in my opinion, there is no doubt that this is a high-risk business. But we need to clearly differentiate the different perspectives. So more and more, on the one hand, more and more studies suggest that female leadership could be differently and beneficial in many dimensions for organizations. So is this really true, that the female women and leaders have unique specificities and features? Well, precisely as you rightly mentioned, COVID-19 has given us a great chance to verify this. And we have seen during the pandemic that if you allow me, more feminine features are more effective. So pragmatism, ability to react earlier, the coherence and flexibility, or the right moment to rectify or to take a step back. So maybe those are features that usually become with the feminine side. In addition, women tend to have a higher aversion to risk, in my opinion. But on the other hand, we usually take a longer term perspective. So this is something that we need to consider when talking about this glass cliff. Finally, of course, all those qualities that can be seen as rather feminine, many men own them as well. So, it's like, the glass is half empty or half full sometimes. So naturally, there is no, let's say, a guarantee for success. So only people that try fail. So you don't play, you never lose. But this is my perspective. Thank you, Danai.
Thank you very much, Margarita. And turning to you, Aniela, when we look at why women fail to progress, or why the system does not does not create the same opportunities. Perhaps it's been described as a structural issue that requires policy attention. We need to level the playing field. We've been talking about different measures that can be taken to achieve that. What do you think is the role of the private sector there as well? Because a lot of central banks also act as supervisors to the private sector. We're not looking at just their own diversity and correcting this in the financial sector, but also what the private sector can do. What's your view on that?
So then you mentioned that one of the reasons that the private sector companies are so fascinating is that because them with their corporate policies, they act within the setting which is set by a certain number of public policies. And they also inherit the culture around the gender roles in each of the countries of operation. So if you want, the companies are both recipients of the influence of these public policies and of the cultures around the gender norms that can either help or hinder what they are trying to achieve. But at the same time, they are not only recipients, or they should not see themselves as mere recipients of that, but also as actors that through the corporate policies are able to inform and to shift both public policies and perceptions. And I have to share with you that in at certification, we work with quite a large number of publicly listed organizations that have seen in the last 10 to 12 months an increased preoccupations coming from their investors, and some of them are the big sovereign funds, some of them are the big pension funds, and an increased level of attention on how shareholder value is produced. So we are no longer preoccupied just by the shareholder value in itself, but the values that underpin the shareholder value creation and how the shareholder value is produced in respect of a certain number of environment, social, and governance standards. And this shift towards how we produce the shareholder value has invited many organizations recently to embrace an expanded definition of success. We see more and more companies in the private sector that start to embed sustainability, capacity for innovation, agility, resilience, and human dignity as part of their core definition of success. So in some ways, we have seen this great shift from gender balance, diversity, and inclusion that was largely seen as a layer on top of a company's core purpose towards a main driver of sustainable success and a factor which is fundamental to the sustainable business success of companies.
Thank you, Aniela. And yes, we have actually quite a few women and men from sovereign funds and pension funds that have also written in the report who are talking about how through their investments they can promote values such as diversity, and definitely the link between values and value, I think, is becoming more understood in the financial sector and more up in central bankers' agendas as well. Let's now move to talk a little bit about how can organizations practically achieve diversity. And Natalia presented a lot of the potential measures that central banks can put in place, what the share of take-up is in some of these policies. And let me ask you, Margarita, because we found in the research that over the last year, 31 new governors were appointed. Only one was a woman in Vietnam. In 6 of those cases, there was a female deputy governor that was not promoted to the position of governor. In some countries, this caused headlines, such as in Canada, for example. And last year, we had the same situation in Ireland as well, in the Eurosystem. But at the Central Bank of Spain, you mentioned you were number 1 last year, number 4 this year. You have consistently done well on diversity. What are some of the practical things that you would suggest to some of our audience, who are a lot of them central bankers, where you can start? What are the policies that work in your opinion and in your experience?
Well, indeed, I agree with you. It sounds a bit striking that only one out of the 31 governors appointed last year was a woman. And I wasn't aware of that. But to be fair, this is not surprising. And of course, it has also happened in the EU. Within the Eurozone countries, there is no central banker or central bank appointed as a governor, being a woman, except, of course, Madame Lagarde, the ECB itself, of course. So, well, I'm not saying that because I wanted a promotion, but anyway, of course, I mean, the public sector has a responsibility to lead by example in these areas, and the reality is that we are far from being a very good example, at least when it comes to the top positions within our organizations. Having said that, I believe that Banco de España made a significant progress over the last years. You know that 56% of our governing council members are women, as well as almost 40% of the executive committee. So, and overall within the institution, we have reached the parity already. So I think that parity for the whole institution is a very good starting point. This is the critical mass for the future. We have a lot of experts and highly qualified professionals amongst our staff, being men and women, of course, with high potential. So now we need to make sure that the right proportion of women is going up in the scale of the hierarchy. Of course, this is about empowering women with potential to leap forward to managerial positions, but it's also about creating an inclusive environment internally within the house. And of course, putting in place enough work-life measures to definitely create this environment. And also, it is very important to share the KPIs, the right KPIs to the right managers in order to raise awareness and, of course, to make this cultural change happen. So, in my opinion, first, the creation for the precondition. Secondly, setting up a sort of internal narrative to raise awareness and precisely very concretely through the right KPIs. And also many other, let's say, softer measures from, maybe coaching, mentoring, and leadership, training with unconscious bias, or making use of unbiased vacancy notices for new positions. So I think that we really miss is to encourage women to aspire to such positions. And we are really working on a talent grid to identify highly, let's say, potential women and also men, but we definitely will be focused on the women to create this kind of talent pool for the upper positions in the scale. So this is our approach here, and just the final word is that for us, diversity is strategic, and it is rightly recognized in our strategic plan.
Thank you, Margarita, and thanks for making the point that it's about having the pipeline, but also nurturing it to grow, because one of the common answers or concerns that people raise when you bring up diversity is that, well, the pipeline is not there, there's not enough women that want to progress, but it is very much about culture. And this morning I was listening to the latest episode of the ECB podcast, and it was a conversation between Christine Lagarde and Ursula von der Leyen, a very candid conversation, and I recommend to everyone to listen to it. And they were sharing their experiences in being leaders and rising through the ranks. And they were saying that throughout their careers, a lot of women said to them, I don't think I can do this. And as a leader, you also have the responsibility to help women and support them and say, you can do this and I'll be there to support you. And having that attitude as well, acting as a role model for others. They also share some very horrible examples of things that have happened to them in their career. Ursula von der Leyen saying that when she took up her minister position, someone asked her, are you going to be a bad mother or a bad minister now? So things like that I think are very, very important in terms of the culture that we set and as leaders. Let me turn to you, Aniela. You've done a lot of work on actually monitoring and measuring progress. And Margarita mentioned a lot of ideas and policies that central banks should put in place, like mentoring, like creating a culture, creating the pipeline. What have been the most efficient means you have implemented to monitor and measure such progress in the central banks that you work with? And you work with ECB as well as the Banco de Mexico.
Yes, and I think that, Margarita mentioned, some of those very key successful policies and practices. Build a pipeline, ensure equal pay for equivalent work, make sure that you have the proof that that's the case in your organization, create an inclusive environment, make sure to stand up for sexual harassment and all forms of discrimination. So I think that, by and large, also when we look at your report this year, we do know more or less what are the key ingredients of the roadmap. What we have found is equally important, in addition to what we do, it's how we do it. So in our experience, the most efficient ways to measure and monitor progress in gender balance, diversity, and inclusion are those ways that are holistic. That's the first element, that look at both quantitative and qualitative aspects, both processes and outcomes. These measures are also transparent. I think that transparency is one of the key elements where we have quite some progress to do when it comes to recognizing that, of course, progress happens against a baseline. And there is absolutely no reasons to be opaque about what that baseline is if there is a commitment to change this baseline over time. The other element which seems to be important, in addition to this holistic and transparent way to measure and monitor gender balance, is that the approaches need to be prioritized. So that is the signal that the organization is really pursuing a strategic objective, when it's no longer a luxury item, that it's pursued in terms of business as usual, when disruptions are not taking place. But when we do see that these actions are prioritized, become part of the lifeblood of the organization, then we will understand that there will be continuity and consistency in the progress. And then the last element which I wanted to mention, which is equally important. So in addition to being holistic, transparent, to being harmonized and consistent, it is so important to hold ourselves accountable for progress. How many times we have been part of conversations when we look at numbers like those today, and we say, well, but there is no pipeline. There was nobody to be appointed, or women do not self-select for this particular type of industry. So we kind of throw our hands in the air and in saying, well, we are not making too much progress, but that's the way things are. Why don't we reverse that paradigm? And we look at each one of us in the positions where we are and in the ecosystems that our institutions are being part of. How can we act so that we not only measure, but we also commit to implementing a certain number of actions, and we hold ourselves accountable for progressing against that action plan?
Thank you, Aniela, and thanks for raising the point about prioritizing. And in the interview that we have in the report with Mary Daly, the president of the San Francisco Fed, she says exactly that, that diversity is not a nice to have, it's essential. You need to make sure that you have the people with the next best idea in the room. It's about accessing the talent pool in the society that you draw your workforce from. Let me turn to you now, Tom. What are your views in the kind of policies that we've heard from Margarita and from Aniela now in terms of achieving diversity, and also bringing it to the context of the pandemic, where some of these measures, mentoring, coaching, creating an inclusive culture, may be disrupted as a result of the work from home format. Last year, Margarita, we interviewed you for the report, and one of the things that you mentioned was that women may be excluded from informal channels of communication, and that may be preventing them from being part of the elite club that does progress. Or there may be these informal channels that they're not part of. So how does that perhaps become worse or strengthened in the time of pandemic and remote working, Tom?
Yeah, thanks. Well, so I'm a big believer that every human is an individual, and that the combination of their own personal development and how they make it work at home is got to be intentional. And so, one of the things I really believe in is trying to understand the totality of each person's situation and trying to help them achieve against whatever the objectives are they've got. This, as you suggest, this pandemic's had a positive and a negative against that. I actually think the flexibility is a positive. People have individual needs, people have individual operating models. And I think in a world where those things were stressed, we and everybody else were able to move quickly to try to accommodate people's situations. I think that's great in the pandemic. That's going to be great outside of the pandemic. I think there are new opportunities that get surfaced too. The two career couples is a classic one where you're trying to make things work and you're constantly trying to, find jobs for one spouse and find jobs for the other spouse. Well, in a remote environment, maybe that'll be easier. You've got people in remote locations for whatever situation. Maybe now in that environment, that'll be easier. Work from home as a solution to emergencies or situations at home with elder care. I think there's a lot that has been unlocked through flexibility that I think is going to help a bunch of individuals on the career side. On the other side, as you suggest, there's a lot of research that suggests that trust and collaboration work better in person than outside. And to the extent that that loyalty to an institution is greater if you have relationships than if you don't. And so one of the things we're really boxing in our shop is, all right, as we come back from this, how are we going to make sure we invest enough in building trust, building relationships, building loyalty, building mentoring relationships, all those sorts of things. In particular, because the individual might have a very legitimate interest in being more remote, but that may or may not be the best thing for their career, if you see what I mean. In other words, that might break you on some of these issues of trust and mentoring and loyalty. And so that's what we're going to be trying to work on the other side, which is how do we make sure we're making the investments that allow people to be more flexible without, losing the trust and those relationships.
She's there.
Sorry, I was thrown out for a second, but thank you, Tom, for your contribution here, even though I didn't get to hear all of it, but I'll rewatch when we have the recording. And let me turn to you, Aniela, on the issue of the pandemic. And how do you think the diversity and inclusion policies have been practically disrupted by the pandemic? In our conversations with central banks, for example, we found that it may be more difficult to measure some of the data regarding gender and diversity. How have you encountered that in your work?
So it's such an interesting conversation because, as Tom mentioned, I think that the pandemic simply magnified some of the existing trends and tendencies. I think that one of the interesting lenses that this pandemic put on the current state of gender equality in the workplace is that we do seem to agree all that women have disproportionately been affected. But why this is the case? Because women tend to be represented in lower paid jobs, in informal jobs, in industries that are less knowledge intensive without P&L responsibility roles. So the fact that they were affected more by the pandemic, it's structural. So if we learn out of it that conscious efforts to build gender balanced talent pipelines will not stop this kind of pandemic and disruptions to happen in the future, but will ensure that these kind of events will not have such a disproportionate effect. Then, of course, Tom mentioned, one of the greatest wins of this period was our understanding of what can be done from where and how team effectiveness can be managed while working remotely. But then I think that another interesting aspect that this period allowed us to be confronted with is the gendered expectations that we have of ourselves and of our spouses. So we talk a lot about the fact that what is going on in the workplace, it's also a reflection for each one of us of what is going on at home. So yes, we saw all kids crawling in the laps of our colleagues while we were on calls, but who got the quiet spot in the office behind the locked door and who had the kids constantly crawling in their laps. So I think that there was a moment of interesting self-reflection and self-evaluation for each one of us, and understanding how these gendered expectations that we have of ourselves and of the others play in the workforce. And I am very optimistic that this very personal, subjective experience that each one of us had in this period will inspire bold actions once we get back to workplaces, whether those workplaces will continue to be entirely remote or whether they will be a combination of in-person and remote, so that we can make the current gender gap a distortion of the past.
Thank you, Aniela. And let me turn to you again, Tom, and you may have covered this a little bit before, but as a central banker, you're not only looking at diversity in your own institution, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, but also in the economy. And we heard from John earlier about the risks of a she-cession that Anna Botin, the chairman of Santander, raised in her article in the report. How have you observed men and women be affected differently in the pandemic? There may be some of the channels that Aniela and you mentioned as well about sharing responsibilities. There was the Financial Times published a survey today on International Women's Day of their readers, and they asked the question of how are you looking at your career? And actually women were much more likely to say that they're close to quitting as a result of the pandemic than men. I think there was a 10 percentage point difference in the FT results today. So how have you seen that affecting the economy that the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond covers?
Well, obviously, growth in the U.S. economy requires growth in the workforce. One of the great stories of the last 50 years has been women's participation in the workforce and how that's increased since the early 70s to today. Interestingly, in the U.S., that peaked just before 2000. And in the 10 or 15 years after that, it actually dropped. And finally, in the last couple of years before the pandemic, it had started to come back up before dropping, of course, suddenly in this pandemic. I want to emphasize that that's working class women. When you dig into the participation stats, it's actually not, upper class. It's working class women. It's not hard to imagine, why that might be the case, because the financial formula doesn't add up. And that's even more the case now. Options in terms of alternative childcare, in terms of tutoring, in terms of helping kids who are out of school, options in terms of your aged parents who you may not want to send to a nursing home now. And so, I'm very much focused on this issue of participation, but particularly these lower middle class jobs that can't be done remotely and you don't really have alternatives. I think that's the issue. There may be an upside, we'll see. The upside might be if we actually finally make some of the investments that we've known for generations we need to make in things like broadband and childcare and education. But those haven't been made yet. That's could be part of the infrastructure conversation that's coming. But I think where we sit right now, I think it's really threatening the growth and participation we've had. And with the demographics of our country, I think that's going to be a problem.
Thank you, Tom. And thinking also about how we emerge from this pandemic, turning to you, Margarita, because you've also been very active at the Bank of Spain talking about sustainability more broadly and the climate issues. And this is something that we're also recognizing very much in the pandemic, that if we are to go back, we don't want to go back to normal. We want to build a more sustainable and inclusive economic system. And it's not about fitting climate and other ESG considerations in our existing model, but rethinking the model to make room for these kind of themes to be part of the priorities. And similarly, thinking about gender, one of the participants in last year's report has said that we shouldn't be thinking about women fitting the models of the business models that we have now, but rethinking entirely the model to make sure that women can play a central role there. How are you thinking about gender diversity and more broadly about a sustainable and inclusive economic system in the day after the pandemic?
Well, as Tom mentioned earlier, I think that I believe that before the COVID, there was already an increasing awareness regarding the importance of inclusion and, of course, regarding the ESG elements, right? So I think that the level of implication of both the public and the private sector was already high, in my opinion. But of course, if anything, the pandemic has increased the visibility and the importance of these issues. Unfortunately, at the same time, as you, also mentioned, Tom, and I think Aniela as well, unfortunately, this has affected women more severely than men. In my country, you can take a look just as the recent news. In terms of unemployment, 70% of the jobs lost were women. So they have, let's say, lower positions in the society, and with less protection from the contracts. So I think this is a direct effect from the pandemic, but also there are new developments. Tom also mentioned, this remote working, or teleworking, as we call it here, is a kind of mixed blessing. In theory, teleworking should help improve the work-life balance, but maybe sometimes it has unintended consequences. The majority of people teleworking these days are women, and working from home, we know all what it implies. So it's far from being in the center of the power. So this might affect in their careers, and might influence negatively in their promotion. So I think that is something that we need to rethink and reflect upon. Once we return to business as usual, of course, we should monitor whether it is still mostly women who decide to telework. Of course, this should be entirely, in my opinion, as a voluntary option. And I think this is not the right way to go back to our traditional care roles on top of the daily work. I think that probably for the time being is too early to say. Of course, we've experienced 10 to 12 months of this situation, but we will see when we go back to normality. So in my view, there are two key elements. First is we need some kind of catching up to go back to our, let's say, starting point a year ago already. And also we should be vigilant about the potential effects of some new developments, such as this remote working. So what do we do for the catching up? So we need to have a level playing field for men and women. This would mean that all organizations must strive to avoid individuals having to give up their career for reasons other than professional ones. And of course, organizations must implement enough measures for an appropriate work-life balance. And how do we encourage these changes? It's difficult, as we already mentioned, to provoke this cultural change, but it is clear that apart from leading by example, the official sector, we can also contribute using guidance, expectations, or peer pressure. So here, probably we as supervisors, we can contribute with some kind of reviews, peer reviews of the governance arrangements and governance frameworks of the institutions, of the banks. Or I have another example here in Spain of the Markets Authority, with expectations of having 40% of the board members being women. So there are various possibilities here to make this change happen.
Thank you, Margarita. Yes, and we are starting to see more and more supervisors look at how they can use their supervisory capacities to advance some of these ESG objectives. See climate stress tests, maybe gender stress tests will be something that comes next. But I'll move now to questions from the audience for the rest 20 minutes of the panel. And thank you also for raising the point about the Bank of Spain and how you've monitored the pandemic affecting women differently. We had a presentation from your chief economist, Oscar Arte, this morning at OMFIF, and he was saying how it has affected groups of different education levels, and so, but he didn't mention the gender angle, so maybe that's something he should be including in his presentation going forward. But we have a question from Marc-Olivier Strauss-Kahn from the Banque de France, who is saying, Marc-Olivier is saying that the Banque de France publishes today the French fiscal support, that the French fiscal support prevents female participation to drop as in 2009. So this is a measure that the Banque de France has taken. Is that something that other central banks are thinking about? I think Marc-Olivier is challenging you all to see kind of how what measures central banks may be taking to look at damages from the pandemic on the gender diversity. Margarita, as a fellow Eurosystem central bank, what is your comment there?
Okay, of course, we are not the ones, providing the fiscal policy measures. It's for the government, but of course it is our research department analyzing the impact of this kind of measures. The fiscal policy. For us, the package is expected tomorrow. There is a cabinet meeting, so then we will see. But as I said, women are being affected the most by this pandemic because they usually have, let's say, the weakest employment of some part of society. It's really full of women having the weakest positions in employment. So this is something that we'll need to assess. Also, the questions that I referred to with teleworking, I think that as it was already mentioned, in my opinion, for teleworking, and probably the studies are already assess that. For creative jobs and for brainstorming, teleworking is not, in my opinion, efficient enough. So probably we will have to work this out and through the combination of different measures in order to get women involved in all these processes.
Thank you, Margarita. And turning to you, Tom, and perhaps making this a little bit more general question, not about what central banks could do now, but if we think about gender diversity as a market failure, as some institutions have called it, because the playing field is not level, is there a role for central banks to correct that through some way, or is it something more for governments and fiscal policy to solve in terms of having initiatives such as the one that Marc-Olivier mentioned?
Well, there's certainly a fiscal and government role here that would be primary. Our new framework review, which we did over the year ended in September, did a couple things that should be interesting on this topic. We, redefined maximum employment as a broad-based and inclusive goal. And of course, the thinking behind that is not just to look at the averages, but to look underneath it, and not just to look at the unemployment rate, but to look at participation. And so I think that gives us a framework in which we can think hard about participation and employment broadly, and also, for particular and important groups of our economy. And the commitment we've made behind that, I think, does suggest that we saw great value in the last groups to get into the workforce in the 2018-2019 framework, and asking the question whether there wasn't more we could do to try to help those folks.
Thank you, Tom. And Aniela, another question that has come through is about the actual impact of diversity on performance. And when we look at the private sector and banks, there have been some studies. The IMF, Ratna Sahai from the Monetary and Capital Markets Department wrote about this a few years ago in our index, that there is evidence that banks tend to perform better if they have more diversity. How about in the central banking community? What kind of measures can we look at to look at what the impact of diversity is, whether it makes for more efficient teams? How do we actually make that business case?
This is such an interesting question, Danae, because I think that I co-founded Edge more than a decade ago. And back then, we used to put upfront some financial indicators as a measurement to prove the business case for investing in gender balance, diversity, and inclusion. Now, what we have learned over time is that the success of the organization is not only measured by those indicators that are very common, maybe, to the private sector organizations. But if you look at what happened over the last months, agility and the capacity to adapt to unknown situations, the resilience proved to be some of the most important organizational skills. And we talked about a lot about the flexible working. And what we have learned in working with organizations that put in place flexible working practices and made sure that the uptake of flexible working was not gendered. So this was not an alternative career path that was made available to a part of the population that was then seen as performing differently than the rest. But it was seen as a way that was embraced by everybody who had a life outside the office, that for everybody that had care responsibility outside the office. So those organizations that put in place, for example, flexible working measures as part of their gender balance, diversity, and inclusion initiatives found out that the moment they had to switch to remote working, they had a huge head start because everybody was equipped. You know, if you look at it even from a very logistical perspective, everybody was equipped. There was certain rituals and routines for teams to communicate, to stay connected remotely. So I think that this is one of the most interesting evolutions that we have seen in the business case. We will continue to talk about the positive correlation between a number of financial indicators and organizations that have more gender balance, diversity, and inclusion. But I think that we became more sophisticated to expand this definition of organizational success and to look at these elements of creativity and innovation and resilience. And as I mentioned, human dignity in the core of our organizations.
Great, thank you, Aniela. And Margarita, and you can also comment on the business case for diversity if you want, but another question that has come in as well is, to what extent in your organizations are women more prevalent at the staff level, and how do they move up the organizational ladder? And you shared some statistics earlier about achieving parity at the entry level, but can you tell us a little bit more, add a bit more color in this journey from entry level to climbing up the ladder?
Thank you, Danai, for your question. I think that we have a very objective way of recruiting, and this is probably one of the key points. So women are performing very well when there is equality in recruitment processes. So during the last 5 years, in many of the vacancy notices, a lot of women posted for, and also many women were successful in the different campaigns. So this is one element. Objectiveness in the recruitment, and of course equal opportunities, and the high performance of women. Secondly, when they are in, as I said, there are a long list of elements from training and development programs, or flexibility at in the workplace, or any kind of support for women. But of course, we have investigated the root causes of, let's say, a lower range of women in managerial positions in some businesses, and through the right key performance indicators. So there are preferences for women and preferences for men. So usually, for example, research with the economists and researchers is more a male, let's say, position, and maybe other areas such as administration or other type of businesses here. I mean, we have a very specific case here with, I mean, dealing with cash and coins and the control of the coins and and the notes, and there are a lot of women there. So we need to investigate further and try to promote mobility in order to have really diverse teams. So one thing is the average, and another very different thing is to have everywhere very diverse teams. And for that, we need to find the right answer to our questions.
No, thank you, Margarita, and thank you also for bringing up this point about the different positions that men and women tend to do, because that's something that we looked a little bit in our index, and we looked at a small sample of 25 central banks. In how many are the HR departments led by men and women? Because that's a classic one that even if you include executive functions, they tend to be more. And we found that in more of these, I can't remember now exactly the number, but it's in the report. In the majority of these 25, the HR departments were run by women. And that's in contrast to the overall picture of gender balance, where you have many more men than women. So it's an important point. And how do we actually change that? What role can role models play, for example? And that's something that we've discussed with many of the contributors to the report as well, that if you don't see people like you in the organization, you're not going to think that such a career is possible for you. And how do you, as a female central banker, encourage other women in the organization to participate and to follow in roles that have to do with supervision, which is your area, and not just in the non-P&L running roles, let's say, because for the commercial banks, that's also something that we found in the analysis, that yes, there's only 3 out of 50 CEOs that are central banks, but that are female. But what does the pipeline look like? And most of the women in executive positions are not usually the ones that would then become CEOs. But let me turn to you, Tom, now. And one question from the audience is that, yes, great, we are talking about gender balance, but it's taking very long to achieve this. So how can we speed up the process? What kind of action can we take? And if I extend that question a little bit, one of the themes anytime we talk about women's progress and diversity is the theme about quotas and whether we should be taking affirmative action to correct years of underrepresentation. Now, a lot of women are themselves divided in this issue, and some say, well, we want to be recognized just because of our skills and our contributions, not because of our gender. Others say that if you don't have such measures, progress will not come naturally. What is your view on that question?
Well, I'll also comment a bit on the conversation we were just having too. I think your sourcing strategy and your diversity strategy have to be in alignment. And so I think it's not a good idea to say, we're going to be 50-50 at the top and say, but don't worry, we're going to wait 30 years until we can start recruiting a bunch of people and grow them there. If you don't have the bench, you have to think about how to build the bench. Obviously, I don't resonate as a diverse candidate when I was hired. But one thing that was diverse about me is I didn't have a classic PhD economics background. I had an economics training and 30 years in business. I don't say that to say anything nice about myself. I'm just saying if I can be successful, that opens the doors for profiles like mine, which allows you to widen the aperture in terms of who you bring into jobs like mine. And so I think you have to think holistic. So I'm not a big fan of quotas, not because there's anything moral about it. I just don't think it motivates the people underneath you. People get at jobs and people think that they got jobs for the wrong reasons. It demotivates the people who aren't in the quota. If you want to build a culture of respect, you actually put in place a diverse team that everyone acknowledges is better than the team you have today. And I just think it's a powerful way to go. What that means is you have to fill the bench. You can do it internally, you can do it externally, you can do it through rotation. You have to do it thoughtfully. When it comes to central bank governors in particular, there is still a bias in many people's minds that what you need are, long tenured PhD economists. That is a profession that is not a gender balanced profession at the senior levels for reasons there's been a lot of conversation about. And so I just think you have to think cleverly about how do you supplement that? How do you find people from the outside you can put into those roles to be ready at the time of? In addition, how do you take the few who have gotten close to the top and make them successful? Personally, intentionally, whatever combination of career experiences and developmental support, so that you can, maximize the chance that you get those folks into the roles you're going after.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for raising that point as well about the different career backgrounds, because when we talk about diversity, it's not just about gender diversity. It happens to be that this report is about gender diversity because we have to start somewhere, and it's an easy way to collect the data, and we hope that we're contributing to the debate in some way. But everywhere in the report, we stress that it's also about having different experiences, different backgrounds, and it's ultimately thinking about how can we have the best team in charge, not the best individual. You don't just look at we need another striker in our football team, because if you have a football team made all of the people with the same skills, you're not going to have a good team. So you need to have a team that thinks well. So thank you very much for bringing this up. And let me turn to you, Aniela, now with the last question, because we're running out of time. And talking again about the pandemic and the teleworking, and a few people from the audience have raised that again, how it's affecting men and women differently, whether you've seen a decline in the performance of people because of teleworking, and whether that has been felt differently across genders. What is your view on this question?
I think it's very important to understand that what we are going through right now, it's in no ways business as usual. What we are doing now, it's not flexible working. There is nothing more inflexible about this. There is no choice. So we really have to look at what we are doing now as an extraordinary opportunity to test and experiment and learn the lessons that will work once we will be able to go back to our workplaces. Of course, long term, when, as Tom said, when you did not connect with the people that you work with other than through a screen for the last 10 months, when the kids have been out of school for so long, when we are all under an enormous amount of mental, emotional, and sometimes financial stress. One of the organizations that we work with very nicely, the CEO sent a letter to the employees recently in saying, I believe that each one of you are doing the best that you can possibly do in these circumstances. And when the circumstances will change, well, let's learn the lessons that we have learned now and apply them in the conditions that will be there once we go back into the workplace. And maybe, so I think it's fair to look at the period that we are looking now as testing grounds that has everything of a testing ground which is artificial. So we will need to be very wise about what we take in the business as usual. And maybe just one point that I wanted to comment on what Margarita and Tom said. So Tom talked about this necessity of expanding our horizons in terms of the profiles. And then Margarita raised this point of, some professions being more attractive to men than women. In our experience in working with central banks and with pension funds, we have seen that, by and large, the nature and the content of some of the professions have evolved over time. However, in the public consciousness and awareness, I'm not sure that people caught up with what it means today to be in a high risk-taking position working for a pension fund. So what is the nature of that job? What exactly that job will enable you to achieve for yourself, for the organization, for the society? So I think that I would invite us all to think of how we can shed some additional light on the kind of professions that are ours, how they changed, and how they are now more appealing to a diverse set of candidates. So let's make them also more appealing, because that will create the demand for those jobs.
Thank you, Aniela. And yes, absolutely. And we've tried a little bit to do that in the report this year. So we've added a new section where we're profiling women that are leading key departments in central banks. So we have a woman from the Banque de France who's leading the climate activities, a woman from the Bank of Thailand and of Greece who are leading the fintech activities, and from the Bank of Portugal who's leading the reserves management, to show their experience and how they're working as leaders in that area. But thank you also for raising the issue about the pandemic and how the letter that the CEO sent to employees. And when I was listening to this podcast with Christine Lagarde and Ursula von der Leyen this morning, one of the things that Christine Lagarde said was that, when you as a leader are working different hours, put in her email that, don't feel the pressure that you have to reply to this email at this time. I'm sending this out of office hours in the weekend or in the evening. And that helps really remove the pressure from those very eager or very work committed people, or women may feel more pressured to prove their worth and to reply to emails out of office hours, that your leader is saying it's okay, this can wait for tomorrow. And I think that's a really good practical example of how you can set the tone as a manager. But thank you all very much for your contributions today. It's a really excellent conversation. I hope we can continue this beyond International Women's Day. It's not just a women's issue, it's something that affects us all. We need to make best use of the talents that are out there. And I think in economics, it's really an area where we need to make more progress. There are a lot of stereotypes. So thank you very much for helping dispel some of these. I'll hand over now to my colleague, Clive Horwood, who leads our editorial and publishing activities, to say a few closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much, Danai, and a big thank you to Margarita, Aniela, and Tom. Your discussion should be not just thought-provoking, but I hope action-inspiring as well. It also reinforces, I think, how important sharing ideas and creating networks can be in advancing this agenda, a core proposition of OMFIF, as you know. Thank you also to the almost 30 leaders across the financial landscape who took time to contribute to our report. Available to download now, of course. They've shared their views and often their personal experiences about how to improve gender balance in these hugely influential institutions. Thanks also to the 50 central banks and other official institutions who participated in our survey, which reveals some progress and, as the team demonstrated earlier, the impact of COVID on working practices. Building back better will face some challenges when it comes to diversity, it seems. Thanks also to the supporters of this project, and especially to EDGE Certified Foundation, who do some important work in this area, as you've just heard. Transparency and holding your own institution to account are vital principles if progress is to continue, as our panelists said just now. It always takes bravery to say we could and should do better. And that really is the purpose of the GBI research and the reason for the work our team at OMFIF has done. And Danai puts it very eloquently in her introductory article to the report. She says, by confronting people with the numbers, we hope to mobilize decision makers towards improving results and measuring progress. The conclusions are clear. Lack of diversity in the field is a structural, persistent problem. Progressive policies are needed to correct the historic underrepresentation of women and level the playing field. And while more balanced talent pools bring hope, the issue will not go away by itself. I've been following the efforts of commercial banks in particular to improve their gender balance for more than a decade now, which is why I was so pleased to be able to extend the GBI's unique methodology to a new set of institutions this year. I strongly believe that most of those banks are truly committed to improving gender balance, and many of their leaders will be disappointed by their score, and they should be in this ranking. The progress is at times glacial, but the firms at the top of our rankings show that consistent commitment will pay off eventually. That's not always easy when the tenure of those at the top is almost always shorter than the time frame that's needed to affect real change. And it's the top of the tree that this research rightly focuses on. If employees cannot recognize people like themselves in those running the institution, then that institution will probably not reach its potential. But we have to look a little further still, as Danai said during the panel, and to what types of role people have at the top of an institution. When we concluded our research a few weeks ago, just 3 of the 50 commercial banks we covered had a female CEO. By April, that number would have doubled. That's progress. It's still only 12%. It's not a tipping point. Maybe it's the beginning of a tipping point. We've gone further down the management chain in our research to look at essentially the pipeline, as we just discussed, of future female bank CEOs. It's not as healthy as the headline numbers suggest, and Kat showed us that in the presentation. If you're a man on a bank executive committee, there's an 85% chance you'll be running a revenue generating business line. If you're a woman, there's only a 60% chance. And when just over 20% of ExCo members are women across the industry, that makes for a disappointing picture. In Europe, for example, we calculated there are just 27 women on commercial bank executive boards today, running business divisions across those 20 banks that we analysed. And yet 36% of European bank board members are women. That, on the headline view, looks encouraging, but it also prompts questions. Are some of these banks hiding their shortcomings in promoting and hiring women through board appointments? Again, you have to look beyond the headline numbers, as the ONFIF GBI does. And does it matter, again, as discussed in the panel, that almost all heads of investment banking are men, and yet the vast majority of heads of HR are women? If you want to achieve balance, I would argue that it does. I would also argue that there is a danger, of course, of reinforcing stereotypes about gender as well. These are issues that I'm sure we will revisit, along with many others, in future iterations of the GBI. For now, as a final word, our congratulations to all the institutions that perform well in the rankings, and our best wishes and encouragement to those who wish to do better. Thanks to the team at ONFIF for putting the research together. Do please download and read the report and share your thoughts on it with us. Do please use those hashtags to keep the conversation going. And most of all, thank you to all of you who have joined us today. If this discussion or our research prompts you to rethink or redouble your gender balance efforts, then the GBI has served its purpose. See you all again soon, hopefully in person next time. And here's to International Women's Day.